He made $17.50 an hour, and he was 3 weeks behind on his car payment. Sitting on the passenger seat beside him was a stranger's wallet, stuffed with $40,000 in cash. No one on earth would have ever known if he kept it. This is what Thomas Bradley did instead. And it is not even the craziest part of this story. The real twist does not happen at the wallet. It happens 3 weeks later, when a 71-year-old man named Harold Whitman shows up at Thomas's front door, and almost nobody saw what came next coming. By the time this story ends, you will understand why people who heard it could not stop talking about it for days, and why the ending is still being shared right now by people who say it changed the way they look at strangers entirely. Here is what nobody watching Thomas that morning could have known. He was 34 years old, raising an 8-year-old daughter mostly on his own, and running a delivery route through a quiet Springfield neighborhood he had driven so many times he could have done it with his eyes closed. His landlord had already warned him he was close to losing his apartment. His bank account had less than $20 in it, and on an ordinary Thursday morning that started exactly like every other morning that month, Thomas reached down to grab a package that had slipped off the seat, and his hand landed on something that was not a package at all. It was a worn brown leather wallet, thick enough that he almost mistook it for something else entirely. He opened it right there in the van, engine still running, and what he found inside made him sit back so fast his head hit the headrest. Stacks of $100 bills, wrapped tightly in a rubber band, more cash than he had ever seen in one place in his entire life. Tucked behind the bills was an identification card, a couple of worn photographs, and nothing else that explained why a man would be carrying that much money in his coat pocket on a Thursday morning. Thomas sat frozen for almost 4 full minutes without moving. No camera pointed at that street, no witness standing at that curb, nothing in the world stopping him from tucking that wallet into his bag and driving away like it never happened. This is the part of the story worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to say what you would do from the comfort of wherever you are watching this right now, already knowing how it ends. It is a very different thing to actually be the one sitting in that van, 3 weeks behind on rent, staring at $40,000 that legally, quietly, and permanently could have solved every single problem you had. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody would have ever known. And yet something about that wallet, something about the photographs tucked inside it, made Thomas Bradley do something that almost nobody expected, something that would end up on the news in 6 different states within the week. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Thomas made the choice he made, you have to go back further than that Thursday morning, back to a small rented house on the edge of Springfield, where he grew up watching his father work 6 days a week fixing cars for people who did not always pay on time. His father used to say the same thing to him over and over, that a man's word was the only thing he actually owned, the only thing nobody could ever repossess. Thomas carried that with him longer than he probably realized. He started community college wanting to study business, met Emma's mother in his 2nd semester, and left school 2 years later when Emma was born, taking whatever work paid fastest because a newborn does not wait for a degree to finish itself. By the time Emma turned 8, Thomas had been driving for the same delivery company for almost 5 years, 12-hour shifts, sometimes 6 days a week, eating lunch alone in his van because stopping anywhere longer than 15 minutes cost him money he did not have to lose. Emma's mother was still in the picture, but not consistently, and most nights it was Thomas picking his daughter up from school, Thomas making dinner, Thomas sitting at the kitchen table helping her with homework after a full shift on his feet. He was not chasing anything remarkable. He was simply trying to keep both of them afloat, one paycheck at a time, in an apartment where the rent kept climbing faster than his hours ever did. 2 weeks before he found that wallet, his landlord had slid a written notice under his door, the kind of letter that makes a grown man's stomach drop before he even finishes reading the first line. Thomas had missed 1 full month and was behind on a second, and the notice gave him 30 days to catch up or begin the process of being removed from the apartment entirely. He never told Emma. He never told anyone at work. He just kept driving his route every morning, doing the math over and over in his head, trying to figure out which bill could wait another week and which one could not wait any longer at all. Harold Whitman, the man who lost that wallet, had lived an entirely different kind of life, though it started in a strikingly similar place. He had spent 43 years running a small hardware store on Kearney Street, a store his own father built with his hands, in the years after the war, the kind of place where Harold knew most customers by name and kept a running tab for anyone going through a hard stretch, no questions asked. Harold never had children of his own. His wife Margaret had passed away 2 years earlier after 39 years of marriage, and in all their years together, the one thing they always promised each other and never quite managed to afford was a real trip, just the two of them, no store to run and no register to close out at the end of the day. 3 weeks before he lost that wallet, Harold had finally sold the store to a younger couple from out of state, closing a chapter of his life that had lasted longer than most people's entire careers. The $40,000 in that wallet was almost everything left from those 43 years of work, meant to be moved into a bank account the following morning, and quietly, privately, Harold had already started planning the trip he and Margaret never got to take, even though she would not be there to take it with him. He told a neighbor once that he wanted to see the coastline she always talked about, just to stand there and know he had finally done it. Harold had slipped the wallet into his coat pocket instead of his bag that day, a small mistake he would not even notice until hours later, standing in his kitchen, patting his pockets in a growing panic that turned his stomach cold. He tore through his car twice, walked back into the pharmacy where he had stopped that morning, retraced every single step of his day out loud to himself, and finally sat down at his kitchen table admitting to himself that it was gone. Along with the money, tucked behind the bills, were 2 photographs of Margaret, the only physical pictures he still carried of her, worn soft at the corners from years riding in his coat pocket. Losing the money was one thing. Losing those photographs felt, to Harold, like losing her all over again, in a smaller, crueler way. Back in his van, Thomas had no idea any of this was true. All he had in front of him was a wallet, a name on an identification card, and $40,000 that could have paid off every bill he owed twice over, with enough left to breathe for the first time in years. He thought about Emma. He thought about the notice sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought, for one honest, uncomfortable moment, about simply driving away and letting the day continue like nothing had happened at all. And then he looked again at the photographs tucked behind the cash, an older woman smiling into the camera in what looked like a backyard somewhere, and something about the way she was looking at whoever was holding that camera made Thomas feel like he was intruding on something that was never his to keep. He sat with that feeling longer than he expected to. He has said since that it was not some sudden burst of certainty, not a movie moment where the right choice arrives wrapped in music and clarity. It was quieter than that, and slower, closer to the same voice his father used to use about a man's word being the only thing he truly owns. Thomas picked up his phone, hands not entirely steady, and instead of calling anyone about a reward, he called directory assistance and asked for a number listed under the name printed on that identification card. The woman on the line found a listing within seconds. Thomas wrote the number down on the back of a delivery slip, stared at it for a moment, and dialed. What happened over the next hour would end up mattering more than either man understood in the moment. Thomas drove out of his way, on his own time, without telling his dispatcher, and pulled up outside a small house on the west side of town, where an elderly voice had answered the phone, sounding shaken and unsteady. Harold opened the door already braced for more bad news, certain a stranger calling about his wallet meant it had been found empty, stripped of everything that mattered. Instead, he found a man in a delivery uniform, holding it out with every single dollar still inside it, exactly as it had left his pocket that morning. Harold would later say he did not even reach for the money first. He reached for the photographs. He stood in his own doorway, holding a picture of his late wife, and for a long moment, neither man said anything at all, because there was nothing either of them needed to say. Word got out within days, the way these things do now. A neighbor across the street who happened to see the exchange and mentioned it to a friend, a local news producer who caught wind of it secondhand, and suddenly Thomas's name and face were being shared far beyond that one quiet street in Springfield. A short segment ran on a local station that evening, and within 48 hours, it had been picked up by outlets in 5 other states, each one adding its own headline about honesty in an era people kept insisting did not exist anymore. Most of what followed was warm. Strangers online called him a hero. Coworkers who barely knew him started telling reporters what a good man he was, and for a few days, Thomas Bradley became a small, unwilling symbol of something people desperately wanted to still believe was true. But not everyone believed it. A smaller, louder corner of the internet insisted he must have known there were cameras somewhere nearby, that no one simply hands back $40,000 for nothing, that there had to be an angle nobody had uncovered yet. Some claimed the whole story had been staged for publicity by the delivery company itself. Others dug through old records looking for anything in Thomas's past that might explain what they assumed had to be a hidden motive. None of it was true, and none of it ever amounted to anything, but for a few days it followed Thomas anyway, showing up in comment sections under his name, in messages from strangers who felt entitled to an explanation he had never owed anyone in the first place. Thomas never responded to any of it publicly. He went back to his route the next morning, same 12-hour shifts, same worn-out van with a check engine light that had been on for months, same overdue notice still sitting unpaid on his kitchen counter, because returning that wallet had changed nothing about his own situation. If anything, the attention made things harder for a while. Customers on his route recognized him now and wanted to talk when he had no time to stop. His employer never publicly acknowledged what he had done, never offered so much as an extra day off, and Thomas found himself, 2 weeks later, further behind on rent than before any of this started, quietly wondering whether doing the right thing had cost him more than it had ever given him back. He never once said that out loud to anyone, but it sat there underneath everything, the entire time, uninvited and impossible to shake. Harold, meanwhile, had gone almost completely silent. No interviews beyond the one short statement a reporter managed to get outside his house the day the story broke. No public comment. Nothing. People who knew Harold said he seemed distracted in the weeks that followed, distant even, like a man working something out in his head that he was not ready to talk about with anyone yet. He canceled a lunch with an old friend from the store, twice. He stopped answering his phone most evenings. What almost nobody knew, not the reporters circling the story, not the neighbors speculating on porches, not even Thomas himself, was that Harold had spent those 3 weeks sitting with Margaret's photograph spread out on his kitchen table nearly every single night, thinking about the trip they never took, and about a young father who had every reason in the world to keep that money, and had chosen not to. Somewhere in the second week, Harold drove past the delivery company's local depot without going in, sat in his parked car for almost 20 minutes, and then drove home again without explaining to himself why he had gone there at all. He asked a neighbor, carefully, almost too casually, whether anyone knew anything about the young driver from the news story, his situation, his family. He learned piece by piece about Emma, about the missed rent, about a man who worked 12-hour days and still could not quite stay ahead. None of it surprised Harold as much as it should have. He recognized something in it. He had spent 43 years watching customers walk into his store carrying exactly that same kind of quiet, exhausting weight, and he had never once, in all those years, figured out a way that felt like enough to actually help. Exactly 3 weeks after Thomas returned that wallet, on a Thursday evening almost identical to the one that started all of this, there was a knock at his apartment door. He almost did not answer it, certain it was his landlord again with another notice. Instead, standing on his doorstep in the porch light was Harold Whitman, holding an envelope in one hand and a set of keys in the other, looking like a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and forgotten most of it the moment the door opened. He told Thomas he had spent 3 weeks trying to figure out how to properly thank a man who had given him back not just his money, but the only photographs he had left of his wife, and that no amount of cash sitting in an envelope felt like enough to say what that had actually meant to him. So instead, Harold explained, standing there on the doorstep with his voice not entirely steady, he had done something different with a portion of what remained from selling his father's store, something he believed Margaret would have wanted far more than any coastline trip they kept postponing, and never got around to taking. The keys, he said, belonged to a paid-off truck, newer and far more reliable than the van Thomas had been driving on fumes for over a year, one that would not leave him stranded on a route or bleeding money into repairs he could not afford. Thomas stood there holding the keys, unable to fully process what he was looking at, certain there had to be more to say, and there was. The envelope held something Thomas did not expect at all. Inside was paperwork for an education trust, set up quietly over the previous 3 weeks in Emma's name, enough to cover her schooling well beyond anything Thomas could have imagined saving toward on his own, no matter how many extra shifts he picked up. Harold told him, right there on that doorstep with the porch light flickering slightly above them both, that he and Margaret had never had children of their own, that this money had been sitting there without any real purpose beyond a trip he now realized he did not actually need to take, and that watching a tired, broke delivery driver hand back everything he had without a moment of real hesitation reminded him of exactly the kind of father he always hoped, quietly, he might have been, had life gone differently for them. Thomas stood in his own doorway and could not say anything for a long moment, the same way Harold had stood frozen 3 weeks earlier, holding a photograph of his late wife. Emma, who had been doing homework at the kitchen table, came to see what was happening and stood quietly beside her father, watching an old man she had never met wipe his eyes on the sleeve of his jacket without any embarrassment at all. Neither man had set out to change the other's life that Thursday 3 weeks earlier. Harold had simply been trying to get his money to the bank. Thomas had simply been trying to finish his route on time. And yet here they were, standing on a doorstep in Springfield, 2 strangers who had never planned on knowing each other's names, having permanently altered the direction of each other's lives, not because of $40,000, but because of what each of them chose to do with it when nobody was making them do anything at all. What makes this story worth telling is not really the money, even though the money is what pulls people in every time it gets retold. It is the fact that Thomas Bradley had every reason in the world to keep that wallet, and not one single reason he could have ever been blamed for it, and he still chose otherwise, alone, in a van, with nobody watching and nothing to gain. It is the fact that Harold Whitman could have simply said thank you once on a doorstep and walked away, and instead spent 3 quiet weeks deciding to hand a stranger's daughter a future he never got the chance to give one of his own. Neither man got anything out of this that they went looking for. They both just happened to be the kind of people who, faced with an easy way out, chose the harder, quieter, more honest path instead, and ended up changing each other's lives simply because of it. The 2 of them still talk, according to people who know them, though neither has ever done another interview about it since. Harold is said to visit Thomas and Emma every few weeks, and Thomas is said to still drive that same truck on his route, license plate frame from the old hardware store still bolted to the front of it. No one involved in this story ever asked to be part of a headline. They were simply 2 people, decades apart in age, worlds apart in circumstance, who happened to make the same quiet decision when it would have been far easier not to, and somehow ended up saving each other because of it. So here is the question worth sitting with as this story ends. Not whether you believe it happened, because stories like this happen more often than the news ever bothers to tell us. The real question is simpler than that, and far harder to answer honestly. If you were the one sitting in that van, alone, 3 weeks behind on everything, staring at $40,000 that legally and quietly could have solved every single problem you had, what would you have actually done? Not the version of yourself you imagine right now, comfortable, already knowing exactly how the story ends. The real version, in that seat, in that moment, with nobody watching at all. Tell us honestly in the comments below. We genuinely want to know, and if this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting on this channel that people say hit them even harder, so make sure you are subscribed before you go, so you never miss the next one.